Welcome back to the Autocar Business Changemakers podcast in association with Tomorrow's Journey. We're back for a second season. I'm joined once again in the studio by CEO of Tomorrow's Journey, Chris Kirby. Today, first guest of season 2. Couldn't be more appropriate. We've got someone with a very wide-reaching remit. This is Lukas Neckermann. He is an advisor to countless firms in the mobility realm, am I right? So perhaps you could just introduce yourself and explain a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. What we do is we help companies understand the mobility revolution. We help investors invest into the mobility revolution, and we help startups thrive in the mobility revolution. It's a term that we defined 10, 11 years ago, where we said that this is going to be a massive transition that doesn't just impact one industry, say the auto industry, but in fact impacts all industries, everything that we touch, feel, and how we get around, how we in fact live every single day.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think just before we get too much into some of the topics we wanted to cover today, Lucas, I was just interested to explore a tiny bit of your background. So today you're in your consultancy role, helping a number of businesses, as Felix said. But your background, again, is also quite diverse. Worked in the startup space, worked in the OEM space. So tell us a little bit about your journey to this point and kind of what brought you into this mobility space.
Indeed, I have been on the OEM side. I've worked at BMW. I've worked in financial services side. I worked at Allianz, different roles, different functions as well. Done a lot of time in sales. I've done a lot of time even in things such as training. Spent a lot of time in strategy and marketing as well. This gives me a fairly broad view on really what's necessary and what we need to succeed in this transformation.
You talked a little bit there about OEM experience. Whenever we speak to someone from a startup, they say that their biggest strength is agility, small size, they can turn rapidly, they can adapt really quickly. Did you notice that coming from an OEM? Did it feel like a completely different environment to working with startups?
Well, I think that's part of the challenge that we still have, is that startups and large corporates still speak a different language, frankly. And in the startup world, you have the expectation that you could just pick up the phone and speak to a CEO, and maybe you can, but if it's a CEO of a 120,000 person organization, maybe it takes a little bit longer to get there. And on the flip side, there is still a latent arrogance, for lack of a better term, amongst the corporates, saying that, well, we can still do this better, in spite of the fact that startups are proving them wrong every single day.
Yeah, I had some interesting discussions recently in a number of countries with large, not just OEMs, but kind of large operators, leasing companies, etc. Of usually a new person coming in and saying, "Oh, we've been trying to build our own tech for 5 years and it's not gone anywhere. Can you help us?" That there seems to be a growth. There's a cycle I always see in the industry of like, we're going to build our own tech. 5 years later, we haven't built our own tech. Let's go and buy some, and then there's another cycle. So definitely an interesting space for startups when it's like that. And that was something you were a bit involved in as well. I remember the first time we met, Lucas, actually. The last thing I went to before lockdown, so it's the first thing I went to where it said, "Have you been to China in the last..." And we were going, well, what's all this about? But you were supporting BMW with the startup event, and that was in one of those programs trying to, I guess, connect the OEMs with startups. So I guess there's been a bit of experience with that. And how have you found that kind of mixed success with some of those?
So I give those corporates who have actively gone out and sought collaboration with startups a lot of credit. And the one you noted, the BMW Startup Garage, is a great example of that. And there are others as well. I've been on a lot of kind of startup journey juries and panels and things like that. That's really useful in terms of just exposure. Now, the question is, beyond the exposure, what does the startup do with it? And on the flip side, what does the corporate learn from it, and how does that interaction work? And clearly, Chris, you've done a very, very good job with Tomorrow's Journey from that.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, the relationship that we have with our biggest OEM relationship is with Hyundai, and that actually came through an accelerator program. So definitely an interesting one and a long time in the making. But we must have, for that one, we must have done 20 others, including the BMW one we discussed, which probably was ill-timed more than anything else, right? But yeah, so it's definitely an interesting one. That there's kind of, I guess, a couple of stages. There's a bit of, are you going to seek help from startups? Step one. Then are you going to engage with them is step 2, and then the third one is actually, does it end up being something meaningful? And there's like kind of a drop off at each stage. Not everyone wants to engage with startups at all. Some do, and those that do, only a few of those end up actually.
In fairness, that's changing, especially now that a lot of those companies that we perceived maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago to be startups are now bigger than some of the corporates that they were challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
we hear a lot about sort of massive car companies having sort of venture capital arms wherein they can access emerging technologies that they then use to drive internal growth. So I guess what's the benefit from a startup's point of view beyond raising capital and establishing stability? Do you lose your selling point? Do you lose your niche in just being folded into a big OEM, do you think?
Well, it really depends on what the nature of that relationship is. If it is a substantial piece of equity that has gone into then the OEM, yes, you do lose a lot of independence. There are some, in fact, who have then gotten into the whole wheel of, well, you need to order your computer equipment through our procurement system and things like that. And once you have that, you lose a lot of the spirit and the motivation and the drive and the independence of being a startup. So I'd be very, very wary of giving up that much equity that you become beholden or dependent on any one particular investor. But on the flip side, really, it gives you an easy and aligned client right away. If that's what you need, and it doesn't prevent you from getting other clients down the road, then that could be a good path.
Particularly in the early stages, it's super interesting to be able to have something to learn from, an analog program to get involved in, where you've got that kind of level of access. It definitely could be super beneficial. Slightly more difficult the older you get, because you say your product is becoming more developed, and as is your ecosystem. One of the areas I want to touch on, just changing tack slightly, is to think about the dealer space. That's something, again, we've had a number of conversations before over our time together, and it also comes up a lot on the podcast. Right?
Yeah, of course.
4 or 5 times last season we were talking about it, and it still seems to be a dynamic space. We've seen, and not wanting to date this recording, but recently Kazoo going into administration.
Speaking of startups and the risks involved there.
I mean, we could do a whole episode on the downfall of Kazoo and the reasons behind it. But lots of threats arriving for dealers and mostly being kind of batted off in lots of ways. But also it's a changing environment for them. So what's your take on that dealer space?
Well, it's very easy for people in the strategy field to look at this and just write dealers off, especially in the mobility strategy. And I've heard it time and time, well, all the dealers are dead. And anybody who says that has never worked actually with dealers or has never worked and understood the sales environment. Now, I've led fairly large sales teams, and the one thing that they all have in common is passion and an understanding of the customer. And that is something that the dealer brings to the table today that an OEM can't do. Right? An OEM is a wholesaler. They are a B2B organization. They sell vehicles to leasing companies, and they sell vehicles to their own captives, and they sell vehicles to dealerships. But they don't understand the customer. They may market to customers, right? Do a big brand campaign, but they don't understand and know and sell to customers. That's where the dealer comes in. Look, the clue is in the name. Right? Dealers deal, right? They deal with customers, they make you a deal, and they understand what it takes to be successful on the ground. Mm-hmm. So I am quite bullish on dealers being able to embrace this mobility revolution, but not all of them, right?
Can't not say the A word in this context, agency. So we've seen over the last few years, few manufacturers have moved towards agency and then backed away from it. Ford, JLR in recent weeks have both said we're not actually going for an agency model, or at least not a completely agency model. Mercedes still sticking with it. It's been a roller coaster for Mercedes. So with that in mind, with the dealer's deal element in mind, representing the brand, selling direct to the customer, what is the motive for agency from that point of view then?
A lot of that has been driven by taking a look at Tesla and saying, well, hey, if they can do it, so can we. Now, what it ignores is the fact that if you're starting an OEM or If you're starting an OEM from scratch and you can do a greenfield, yeah, great. Then you can do that. But you have to work with what you have. And if what you have is, a great B2B sales organization, in the headquarters, and great dealers, show the dealers some love. Man, this is a relationship that has gone stale for so many of them, and if I'm a dealer now, I'm looking at all of the legacy OEMs and saying, am I getting the love that I deserve? And then all of a sudden you have this incredible crowd of new brands that are coming in and showing me a lot of love. And I'm saying, hey, I am going to build my Neo, my BYD, my, Polestar, whatever brand shop, because that's where I'm getting a bit of love. The new brands coming in, they need dealerships. They need the dealerships for presence. They need the dealerships for brand awareness. They need them certainly for servicing. Even if we all agree that the servicing is going to be less and an EV only comes through the door every 2 years, still, people need the comfort of that.
It's interesting you say new brands need dealerships because, 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, Polestar and Genesis both launched in the UK as standalone brands without dealers. They were the big new brands for the UK.
But with with a strong component in leasing.
Of course. But their physical presence in the retail space was limited to these sort of shopping centre mini showrooms. Genesis now moving away from that, of course, because it needs an expanded retail presence. So, beyond visibility, there's probably much to be said from a footprint standpoint in having an established dealer network of people who know how to sell cars, which we constantly hear car companies don't know how to do.
Yeah, I definitely think if you had exactly to your first point, Lucas, if you had a greenfield site, you wouldn't build, I would argue, the whole automotive industry, you wouldn't build it like this, not just the selling model, right? If you look at how many layers there are between, coming up with the idea of a car and then getting it into a customer's hands.
The relationship with the tier 1, tier 2 suppliers as well would look very different today.
Literally just starting from there all the way through to how they're geographically managed and all of those things. So it's definitely an interesting challenge. And that piece about the car, the OEMs not ever selling a retail. They've never sold a car. People used to be surprised. 5-10 years ago, I'd say to people, you can't not buy a car from the dealer. And they go, yeah, what about fleets? No, a fleet might do a deal with a leasing company who might have terms directly with the OEM. They still buy it. It's still delivered. My first ever job in a Ford dealer, we used to deliver cars to local fleets via leasing companies. And unless you were like maybe the MOD, maybe even those, they were still prepared by a dealership. So you can't not buy a vehicle. An OEM has never sold a car, ever, on a retail basis.
Now, there's a caveat that I make to this. There are dealers, of course, that, as with any other industry, that aren't good at what they do. That are, see, okay, well, here's my list of, cars coming off lease, coming off financing, whatever else. If you're not chasing those down like a hound, then you're missing a trick, obviously. The other thing that they have to do, to my mind, is embrace the other half. And what I mean by that is, look, here in London, half of households never get any impact or attention from a dealership because they don't need it. They don't own a car. They don't want to own a car. The auto industry as a whole over the last 10 years has been stagnant. The world's population has increased by 1 billion people. Global GDP has gone up by 1/3 in the last 10 years. And in the last 10 years, 2023, end of 2023, we didn't sell one car more than we did in 2013. So we're talking about a stagnant industry here. In strategy terms, this is an absolute red ocean, right? This is lots of people doing bloody battle for the same customers. And on a per capita basis, car ownership is going down, globally speaking. So let's look at, how does the other half live? Yeah, the other half lives with mobility, access to mobility. And that, I think, is a huge, huge potential, blue ocean on the other hand, for dealerships. To say, look, hey, I can't sell you a car today because you're too young, you're too old, you may have an impairment that doesn't allow you to drive, but what I can do is sell you miles. Or what I can do is sell you an e-bike or give you access to ride hailing, or, that term we used to call mobility as a service, right? That is something that is a complete open field for dealerships. And there are some good examples of that. There are examples in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, where dealership groups have embraced all the different new modes of mobility. And if they do that, then they have really lots and lots of growth potential as compared to the stagnation of automotive.
Yeah, I definitely think that's is such a key point for dealers, and I feel really conflicted from a dealer side because I see the opportunity that you've described and I see people doing it well, but I do still believe that on a large part, dealers don't necessarily do the best job at selling cars. So then when you bring these other things in, you say, okay, is it? And of course they still sell cars, and of course they're insulated from the effects of people like Kazoo and other things because of the complex nature of the industry, not because of the great job that they do. I think there sometimes is a disconnect in people's minds of going, well, Kazoo's failed because dealers are brilliant. That's absolutely not. There's absolutely 400 reasons why they failed before you get to dealers are brilliant. Exactly. So I think there's a bit about changing their game and upping it at the same time. And as you say, you mentioned some of the good examples, and there are good ones. But yeah, I think that there's definitely, it feels like a huge opportunity, but feels like actually some of the basic stuff is still lacking in some of those areas.
What could that look like in the UK? You say that a dealer group wanted to diversify its mobility offering. What could they do that they're not doing already?
Well, obviously you don't sit back and say, well, the brand is going to carry it, and anyone who wants a, Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW winner is going to walk through my door, and that's all I have to do. No, you go out to the base that you have and find out who hasn't bought a car and find out why they haven't bought a car. And again, you can start with the customers that you have and find out other people in their family. Do they not have a car? How are they getting around? Right? No matter if we have a car or we don't have a car, we're spending $300, $400, $500 a month or thereabouts on mobility. Now, would I expect a dealer to sell them a train card, a travel card? Probably not. Would I expect them to sell a subscription to an e-bike or something like that? Yeah, why not?
But they risk, it's the turkeys that voted for Christmas, isn't it? If the more people you sell e-bike subscriptions, the fewer people you're selling cars to. So how do you sustain your margins, your workforce, your general activity? You become a completely different business.
Well, you create margins in a new business line. I mean, yes, of course, you're not going to have recurring revenue if you don't sell the car. But on the other hand, as we've already said, the automotive is a stagnant industry, globally speaking, and decreasing on a per capita basis. So you have to go out and address the non-customers in addition to the customers that you have.
You could argue as well that the increasing threat of the more EV sales that have happened. I believe EVs are going to last longer. People are going to change them less frequently. That won't happen straight away because the technology is moving quickly and people are going to, I want the next new thing. I want the next new thing. But I have in my household a 4-year-old 60,000 mile Tesla that I just got on subscription for a couple of months. It is like brand new.
Absolutely.
And that's going to mean that eventually they'll get to a point where people are just going to go, I'm just going to keep this car.
Now, there is, of course, a churn effect now, right? If there is going to be an increase in vehicle sales now, as we very well know, it is going to be electric or electrified, no question about it. It's because out with the old in with the new. It's very, very clear, electric vehicles. Just the experience, the form factors, the, UX, UI, we would call it, is so much superior to, the old. That's incentive enough to switch. I would even argue, would a Tesla, would a BYD, would a Polestar, if it were internal combustion, be as successful? It probably would be or would have been, maybe even more so. And so they're not selling because they're electric. They're selling because they have an incredible user experience inside the vehicle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you combine with home charging, it's a good usage experience.
Yeah.
I never have to go to a petrol station.
Yeah.
I'm coming to Twickenham today, right? Just make sure I plug it in overnight. It charges on a cheap rate. It costs me £8 or something to get 250 miles, and that's fine. So that experience in itself, and then you have
I need
the
to come and charge at
drivability
your
of it.
house, I think.
That's my new tariff. I'm very proud of.
Yeah, fantastic.
But yeah, so I think that overall experience is good. And often I say that to people because people think I'm kind of like big EV advocate, environmental, etc., etc. And obviously that's an important thing to me, but that's not why I tell people they should buy an electric car. Because it's better.
You use the word churn. We hear this all the time. There's churn of car ownership, and I think what's ingrained in the retail space is this facelift cycle. A car is on sale for 3 years, then it gets a new touchscreen and a new front end and new LED headlights. People's lease scheme ends, they swap into the new one, fine. But car companies are designing cars now to have over-the-air updates. They're saying the facelift is dead. So, in 10 years' time, are we looking at people keeping their cars for 7 years, 8 years at a time? And what does that mean for, post-sale revenue, I guess? Can dealers levy charges on subscription services?
Absolutely. We need to figure out what the business model of that is, by the way, because that's something that everybody wants a piece of. You're absolutely right. Back when I was in the OEMs, this was the standard model. You release a vehicle, 3 years later, facelift, 3 to 4 years later, it gets replaced. I think all of the Chinese brands in particular have thrown that model out the window. Time to market is now measured in 12 to 24 month cycles, not 60-month cycles. So the expectation has increased. At the same time, we have, people holding onto their iPhones longer than, 3 years, the 3-year contract. They have a desire to make things last longer. As long as the hardware is keeping up with it, let's make sure that the software updates. And the more and the better the software updates are, great. Hey, let's do it. And who knows, maybe there's even a model for modularity in the hardware that you can take pieces of the hardware out, put new pieces in, something that hasn't really been explored, hasn't been a desire to be explored, but why not?
Yeah, you could definitely see that happening. I think I talked about a number of years ago, we wrote a white paper. I was actually talking about autonomous vehicles, which is an area of expertise for you as well, Lucas, and probably not one we'll go loads into today, but it was that thought of they were like, and I don't know if you know this example, but Trigger's broom from Only Fools and Horses, when he said, I've had this broom for 15 years and it's had 10 new handles and 15 new brushes. An autonomous vehicle could just be like that. It's like it's lasted forever, but none of it's the original parts. And you could really see, probably less in the today retail Tesla Model 3 example, but as they become more shared, potentially more autonomous, you see a thing of like nothing ever rolls off the factory, just parts, and they're being repaired locally and all of that kind of stuff. And if the software's being updated, that need for a production line to be producing tens of thousands of vehicles every year. It's
3D printed locally.
Yeah, 3D printed locally, absolutely,
Yeah, I went to visit a company called Diversion out in California, and they've got this new manufacturing method. It basically 3D prints aluminum structures. They say aluminum, I should say aluminium. Sorry, Californian in me. But they said that could be a step change. Cars can be built in sort of modular components. A customer can bring it back into the dealership after 3 years. They can have the new bumper put on their car. They can have the new headlight housings put in their car. Yeah. You mentioned hardware changes. It's not unfeasible. But that requires a total mindset change from the top level at OEMs rather than the dealer, the retail space. It feels like they almost have no control over what they could be selling in 10 years because they're just taking what's fed to them.
Well, let's face it, the OEMs, they don't have the customers, they don't have the investors, and they don't have the KPIs for it either, right? They're locked into a certain customer base that have a perception of what their brand is, and that brand is tied up into, what does a whole vehicle look like, not a bag of Lego pieces that I can put together as a vehicle. They don't have the investors. The investors have an expectation of a certain ROI, and that expectation is tied up with, dividends or share buybacks on a regular basis. To be honest, which I don't quite understand because so many of them are family-owned or long-term owned. The fact that they're still churning out dividends at the level that they are is bewildering to me. And the third part, though, and this is crucial, is the KPIs. All of them, all of the CEOs and the leaders are measured in what? Not exclusively, by the way, but in how many vehicles did you sell and what is your revenue? They're not being measured in how many trips have you done, how many miles have you sold, how many customers have you made happy, for what period of time. There may be an NPS component to it, customer satisfaction, this or that, but ultimately the KPIs need to evolve as well. And that in turn brings me back to the investors. They need to hold the OEMs to account, not for giving me a quarterly dividend, but giving me a long-term sustainability of the business, which in many cases with the legacy OEMs, I'm questioning right now.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I totally see that as well. I think there's a lot that are keeping to that model and kind of going, we're going to change, but looking to change 10% and the market's changing 60, and that could leave some, I think, in a super vulnerable position. If you don't have one of the strongest brands out there, that you can see manufacturers dropping away pretty
well, we
quickly.
need to separate as well the brand and the manufacturer, because with the legacy brands, you're going to see the manufacturing move swiftly eastward. You don't see very many home electronics still built in the US.
Well, this
Europe,
is contingent on not anymore. The Austin princess died too soon. That's contingent on sort of tariffs, of course. There's lots of talk about tariffs being levied on Chinese built cars.
Are short-term gain, long-term pain.
And all the European car companies are saying that as well. They're saying to the Commission, if you impose tariffs upon them, they'll impose tariffs upon us, and you foster a non-competitive environment. And I guess the same is true of the retail space, of the dealer networks. Competition is key. You need that competition between even the same brands in the retail
And again, this
space.
takes us back to the dealers. They have the opportunity to bring in the new brands, right? If they're not getting the love,
totally.
they can bring in the new brand and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to reduce the floor space for my three-pointed star or my propeller or my four rings, and I'm going to put in something with a different sound to it.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And particularly where there was, not that many years ago, people sort of clamoring for particular brands. Definitely I want the Range Rover, Land Rover brand because it's selling loads and making loads of money. You can see a lot of that changing.
Yeah, I saw 4 BYDs on the way to the office this morning. It's not hard to imagine that that name is already becoming quite well known to the public just through exposure. And we also, I think we've spoken about it before on the podcast, Chris. Is people are more brand agnostic than they used to be. As long as a car has a range of 300 miles, which seems to be the golden number.
And that
as long as it has
even
a
more if you're
touchscreen.
sitting in the back of the vehicle.
Well, exactly. I don't not get a bus because it's a Volvo rather than a Dennis. That's my bus brand knowledge.
Dennis around.
Oh, I don't know actually. I went to a BYD bus reveal event earlier this week. Actually, that was really interesting. I was going to mention it just
the
quickly.
double decker, the new one.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a really interesting mobility story because I think what a lot of people don't know is that BYD is a huge bus manufacturer. It's delivered 2,000 buses in the UK now. So it's got its foot in that mobility lake as well as the
You can't find a public transport operator that's still buying lots of diesel buses anymore. It's just not happening.
But I wanted to mention it because what you mentioned about judging companies by miles travelled of their products, that is what BYD was shouting about. Our buses have done 18 million miles in the UK since 2013, and there's a much more tangible metric that has impacted many more people than the same amount of miles in cars, you would think.
Yeah, I mean, Transport for London does, what is the number? I think 3.3 billion trips every year. Now, if you
it's meant to be 6, but some were on strike. And...
Well, there's no way. There's no way that the few cars that exist in London do that many trips. They don't do a fraction of that many trips. So, the number is out there, and that should impact, and in fact, be a big driver in turn for taking us back to the dealerships, but also for public policy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, just picking up on the KPI point as well. So I know, thinking about the miles driven, all those kind of things. So we've talked a lot about churn in the past, and a thing that kind of considering the difference between a sale and a renewal. Again, we have the experience of both of our OEM days of it. I want to renew the customer, so you sell it, forget about them, and then you want to try and renew them in that renewal cycle, to the idea that you would have if you were a subscriber of Netflix, you're thinking, like, what's my monthly churn? Yeah, well, how many customers have I lost versus how many have I had signed up? And the small change in that metric, and that goes back to the thing we discussed right at the start of, if you're a wholesaler, what's your job? You just want to sell. But then actually, if you're a company's kind of owning the life cycle of the customer more, you just think about how many customers are on your books. That should be the number one. How many customers are driving our cars today? And I don't care whether they've just bought a new one or not, but how many are in it?
And how many touch points, how many tools, devices have I sold to that customer? Now, Apple didn't sit back and say, hey, I've sold the customer one laptop and that is going to be my customer for the next 3 years. No, they sold them an iPad, a couple of iPhones, and subscriptions to this, that, and the other thing. And in the same way, the dealer can say, okay, yes, that household already has a car, but I'm also going to sell them this, and this.
Yeah, and it makes them more sticky. So to the point of saying, oh, well, maybe Turkey's voting for Christmas. I don't know if that's necessarily true, because if you've got a customer today who has 2 cars and they're going to end up going to one, but maybe they go from buying, let's say, a BMW to a BYD. Well, actually, if you sell them that one BMW, but you also can tie in a subscription to an e-bike and some other bits, all of a sudden they become sticky. And if you make that contract on the vehicle, like, kind of not ending, so again, where kind of car subscription models come in, is that the customer never goes, oh, I've got a renewal date now, I've got a decision to make. You just have them in a cycle, and they just go, right, I'm coming to the end, like I'm coming to the point where I want to change this or upgrade it. Later down the line, that could just become an upgrade of, well, I just want the latest wheels put on it or the latest headlamps. But you're then managing, this comes back to the churn point, you're then managing, is the customer going to leave me for another, rather than can I sell them one? Yeah. And I think it's a subtle difference, but
we're getting there, aren't we? I think companies are offering accounts for different charger services. You can just have a Kia charge card and you can access it. Most of the chargers in the UK, I think, when you buy an EV now, you get offered a good rate on a charger installation at home, and you can activate subscription services through the touchscreen on some cars now. Which a lot of people get quite annoyed at. It's this ecosystem idea, isn't it? It's
it's definitely at its infancy, and I think it's going to be the thing of who can move fastest. Because I do think that customers, whilst they might not be saying they want it because they kind of don't know the concept, if you look at how they consume basically anything else, it will be an obvious thing. But whoever gets that and moves it fastest could accelerate their position in the market.
Yeah, it won't be long until you're buying your milk off Ford and your bread off BMW and all that sort of thing. So
if the brand loyalty
where
is
does
there.
it stop?
Yeah, well, exactly.
Of course,
That's what it comes to. It would be interesting to see how the brand loyalty sticks, of whether it moves to some of the newer brands or whether it moves to more traditional consumer brands, where people start to think about things like leasing and subscription, and their relationship becomes more with the leasing company or the subscribing company rather than the car brand.
We have to think about those brands that are incredibly successful in customer service and have incredible loyalty on 60 other products. And obviously the one that comes to mind is Amazon.
Yeah.
Right. And we know that they have launched into this space with a trial project with Hyundai. And now if you've tried it, the the customer journey isn't particularly great quite yet, but they have a history of kind of improving their product over time. And then you've got other bits and pieces like the Rivian bit, the Zoox bit, where it feels like there's a couple of puzzle pieces coming together.
What does customer service look like now? I've got this maybe quite antiquated view that customer service is being offered a coffee when you come in, and maybe there's a bit of cake as well, and they take you around the car that you really like the look of. But maybe customer service now, with that in mind, is more about efficiency, is about streamlining the sales process, maybe minimizing interaction to an extent and just making it as easy as possible.
Well, ultimately, and ideally, they would know who you are well before you even walk through the door, right? Because you have done the search online and maybe through your search history, and if you go even further, your purchase history, have a really, really good profile of who you are, who your family is. Now, this sounds scary and eerie, but we've already shared all of that data, and we've done it willingly. So the idea that, oh my goodness, they're using all of our data to sell us something is, we're past that point, a decade ago. So we will see the AI create the model ideally for our needs and our desires before we even know them.
You've opened a massive can of worms there with sort of 10 minutes left to go of the podcast. But just quickly, because you mentioned it, AI, what role does that have to play in the context of what we're talking about?
Knowing you, and think about those companies that already know you very well. That because they have your calendar, because they have your emails, because they have all of the data you've already fed into that know where you're going to go, how you prefer to go, how much you're going to spend on it, and then they're going to make you a solution based around that. That, I think, has got to be the killer app with AI and mobility.
It's robots selling cars that drive themselves to people.
Whether it's a car or not, I'll park for a moment. But yeah.
And let's get that quoted for 10 years' time when that becomes reality. But I think it is interesting about that piece. I think there is a bit of a detachment between what is the old school idea of the customer experience versus new school. And I think obviously AI has a big part of that, but I definitely think the efficiency is a key thing. The thing that, going back to previous point about dealers, that buying a car is still really hard. No matter how you want to do it, whether you want to test drive a car, whether you want to lease or rent or whatever, like, it's still way harder than it should be. And I think people still have this perception in the industry, still have this perception that, well, if you can have a nice friendly person greeting them and get them a cup of coffee, that's okay. But the customers, like, I want to get the thing I want to get done. Our patience as consumers is
I don't want to devote a weekend to the act of identifying.
We've artificially created complexity. We've conflated personalization with complexity by creating 7 billion different configurations on a 3 Series. I don't know if that number is right, but the idea that it is only your personal 3 Series if it's the light tan, not the dark tan, but the light tan vegan leather in the sport, not the comfort version. With this particular and that particular set of options and that set of
of course, the dealer doesn't
really
necessarily want you to do that because they've got stock to shift and they've got to consider residuals. And if your car is
depending on countries as well, but
there's
still some countries where people actually think that that's relevant.
And it does make it, but also the method for buying a vehicle is complex, and the artificial complexity I think is so true. And I don't think, obviously, not deliberate artificial complexity, but I had pretty much whenever I'm doing talks or even podcasts, I always talk about my mum as our like experience, because she's just got rid of her ID3. She's bought a BYD, at least a BYD. So again, when we talk about this ownership to usership thing, 2 cars ago, my mum bought a car outright, bought a Skoda Yeti, I think they had. PCP'd an ID3, gone straight to a lease. Because they're like, literally my stepdad's like, why do I want to own a car now? I'm like, oh, thank God, I've been saying that for 20 years.
You've done it. You've done it. Convinced
But it was coming towards the end of March, I think, with BYD. They actually didn't have a great experience in the dealership. Looking at a lease through GridServe as a broker. Went to put the order in. I can't place the order. Why not? Because the rate book's not loaded by the leasing company, right? And I've been on the other side of this, so I'm like, right, okay. It took 6 days, and they just went, it happens every quarter. I'm like, yeah, that's fine, but my mum is having a heart attack because she's going, my ID3's got to go back in 3 weeks.
130-year-old industry, and we haven't mastered this.
I know. Honestly, I'm there just going, I know that, and they're saying to me, they're going, well, Chris, you know this is what happens. And I'm like, I know, but it doesn't mean, as a customer, it doesn't mean that it's good enough. The customer doesn't care about your problems, and we just make these things so complicated and seem to think that just because it's just the thing that's always happened, that everyone should be okay with it. That should have been a transaction that took less than a day. I want to lease it. Here's the rate. I'm not negotiating on price. It's this much per month. This is my deposit.
And that's the benchmark that's being set.
It took 2 weeks.
Right?
For it took 2 weeks to get the order, and then another 2 weeks to deliver the car. Yeah. It should have been done in a week. The whole thing should have been done in a week. And I think we're such a long way away from that. And so I think it does come back. What we see is like, it's just convenience. It's like, how quickly can I get through this process? And yes, people want to test drive a car in some cases. Again, my mum wanted to go and see it and look at it. Right, fine. I don't care because I know they're all good. So it's just whichever one meets the specification. There's some people who are going to want to test drive it, but they don't want to have that whole weekend experience anymore.
Yeah. Well, this is something that just sort of quietly seems to have been phased out. There was the whole, come and pick up a car from us on the Friday and give it back on the Monday. See if you can live with it. And I think you're completely right. I think people they see a car they like, they see what sort of fuel economy it does or efficiency, and
start with the notion, come and pick it up from us.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, DS was doing deliver to your driveway. I remember that. That was. I think they still are actually.
I'm hoping that this semi-secret project actually might be live by the time this goes out. But we're looking to do with a non-OEM brand actually, but with a consumer brand that we work with, a test drive but straight into subscribe. So having vehicles that they have available flexibly, customer can come test drive it, take it for an extended test drive, and then stay in that as a subscription vehicle should they choose to go through that process. As a trial, I don't think that's going to get a huge uptake in exactly that scenario, but the idea of being able to drive it and then go, okay, right now I want to quickly go into something else.
You mentioned something earlier, which was the notion of new versus almost new. Now, we've always had kind of, barely used and 6-month-old vehicles, et cetera, but with the quality of cars as they are, especially EVs, I think that's going to change as well. I mean, we have completely normalized things like back market as well, where you take 2-3-year-old products. So there's huge potential in the leasing and the financing, taking 2-3-year-old vehicles and making them accessible as well. Put an update on it, change the software, as good as new.
Yeah. Because in an EV particularly, because the running mechanism, the battery and the motors doesn't really change. You just have to refurbish the car to a level. So typically an ex-lease vehicle would just get sold almost like sold as C and some marks and things on it. But actually, if you take a bit of time to refurbish that car and then put it out as a 3-year-old car and you give it the appropriate warranty, or if it's on a lease with a maintenance package, I just think that those and definitely. Today, we're looking at kind of used car EVs and some used car EVs, EV residual values. I think that there's a huge opportunity to tackle some of that price challenge around EVs, about them still not being able to tap a certain part of the market because they're too expensive. I've seen some second-hand end of lease used leases on EVs, a 2-year-old Tesla with 18,000 miles on it, 300 quid a month.
Yeah.
350 quid a month. All of a sudden becomes really accessible.
Yeah, someone on my Twitter X feed yesterday posted I think a £16,000 Jaguar I-Pace. 5 years old and £16,000 for this once, flagship luxury car. It's absolutely ridiculous. But it's interesting you bring up used EV prices. We've run a story quite recently. Again, not to date this episode too much, but used EV prices in certain price brackets of certain ages are approaching now parity with petrol and diesel. Yeah. So that's becoming less of a consideration. I think if someone thinks, right, I want a nearly new Peugeot 208, I haven't got to factor in the cost of, do I go for the petrol, do I go for the EV? I just need to know which one is easier for me to live with. And if you can make the case for the EV, then it's a done deal.
Yeah, it's normalizing really the EV. Now we are at the state now where petrol and diesel vehicles are the minority of new vehicles sold across Europe, right? The majority are hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and BEV, and the bulk of those actually do have a plug. That means that, yes, we've got a flood of used vehicles coming through. We've got a lot more knowledge in the market as well, people getting comfortable with it. I think the test isn't the first EV that you buy, but the second one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? When you all of that uncertainty goes away, that first one may still be a hybrid or a plug-in. That second one is going to be
and particularly if you've got a bit more flexible access, shorter term leases, subscription models. Once you get used to it, and I've talked about my EV transition experience, it was one of just going, I'm going to give it a try, and I went, this is great, and just that I wouldn't not have one now, but I wanted to. I went into something for 3 months when one car went back, and between another one, and that was enough. And before Felix wraps us up, I just want to touch, because we've talked about EV sales. I think we were talking about this before, of kind of a bit of a red mist moment for both of us, talking about EV sales declining, and just wanted to briefly touch on that with you, because they're not.
Oh, Felix, here comes another 20-minute rant.
I thought I'd get that in before he could wrap us up.
Highlights reel.
I mean, look, we always have to take a step back. You don't look at things in a quarterly, and I said that was a mistake that was being made so much. But here we've had a month of flatline, not even decrease. We've had a month of flatline in certain markets, and those are easily explained away by 2 or 3 things. a flood of demand that went in through November and December because of incentives, and then that they took a short breather, but the trend is sustained and continuing. Mm-hmm. And even more so if you take a look at it in the 1 year, 2 year, 5 year perspective, there's zero question in my mind of this transition. Quite the opposite. Yeah. Quite the opposite. And I think you were giving some examples, Chris, on other markets, other industries.
Yeah, so I was interested actually when I've been thinking about this ahead of the episode. So I mean, the first thing is to say that as we are sitting here towards the end of May, so now I've definitely dated the recording this episode, but it was going that way anyway. So that there's still, in the UK at least, battery electric vehicles are still 10% up year on year. So it was an evening off of a month. And maybe it was 30% last year, 40%, whatever, but it's a 10% overall. It's still double the amount of diesels sold. So that's going to be your first bit. But I was looking at iPhones. One of the things when I was mulling it over, I was thinking, I wonder if this has happened with other things, because not every product on iPhone is probably one of the most successful consumer products of all time. I was like, well, that can't have grown just 20% month on month for 15 years. Yeah. And it didn't. Went from 1.3 million in its first year, 231 million last year. Mm-hmm. Terrifying numbers. But 2016 was a drop, 2019 was a drop as well. 2019, there was less iPhones sold than in 2014.
So 2019, they must have said, well, the iPhone age is over. Nobody's ever going to use smartphones. Let's go back to rotary, because that's something everyone can use.
And that's looking at year on year. We're only talking about a month evening off. Right? It's absolutely bonkers.
The risk of extending this episode to 3 hours long. How much do you think that you said this trend is sustained and continuing? How much of that is a product of legislation and incentives towards EVs? Because if you look at the data from the early days of diesel in sort of the late 90s and into the 10s even, because taxation and fueling a diesel car was much more cost effective,
there's no doubt that legislation and government creates a nudge, right? But it doesn't automatically determine what people buy. People still have a choice, and they are choosing to buy electric vehicles. They're choosing to buy them for the user experience that we've already talked about in this episode, and surely many other episodes before, about the user experience. And that's the key point for me. There's very little investment still going into the internal combustion engine and the wrapper it comes in. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of investment going into everything else, everything that's electrified, everything that's autonomous, everything that's shared mobility. So just on that basis alone, why would you buy something that even most OEMs have declared to be a runoff product?
Yeah. It is great. It is a crazy kind of consideration that the sales would somehow drop, or that they're not going to be a thing. I do think that there's an element of a role that incentives have played, particularly taxation around company cars, salary sacrifice, and I believe, again, without wanting to open this for another 3 hours on Chris's analysis of used car residual values, but that impact of salary sacrifice, people have been able to buy basically at a 40% discount on a lease price. Those vehicles come back second hand. They're not effectively 40% discounted anymore, so there's a gap in the market, there's a fluctuation, and those RVs were set too high, and many things. But that's just a blip. That's not saying people are only buying them because of that. That was just
it's a nudge. It's not a determining factor.
More into the market maybe than it would have done, and push people a little bit more than it would have done. It's clearly something that will be it's not a loophole because it's deliberately there, but it'll be something that will be closed over time, no doubt. But the market will do that. It will have these kind of ups and downs and bobbles. But I think that I still just go back to the same thing. The user experience is better. I think when someone takes one on salary sacrifice, they go, this is great, it's 40% cheaper. But I believe when they came out of it, if that incentive wasn't there, they wouldn't go back and buy petrol. I just think maybe they'd choose maybe they wouldn't get the top end Tesla, and maybe they'd end up getting something cheaper. But I don't know that they would go, oh, now I'm going to go back to buying a diesel Audi. I don't believe that's going to happen.
Well, maybe on that bombshell, on those protracted closing thoughts from each of us there, we'll round up there. Thank you so much for joining us, Lukas. Chris, thanks for coming back.
Thanks.
And thank you to you for watching and listening. You can find all the episodes on the Autocar Business website. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again next time.